Hi YouTube, welcome to the Pagan Perspective. I'm Megan, aka Sabiristry, and this is Subs Week. Hi YouTube. Today we're talking about hoodoo, voodoo, and labels. So for our first question, Art Lily 8 is asking us about voodoo. Basically, what I'm hearing from Art Lily is that what are our thoughts and opinions on the practices and teachings of voodoo? And do we know any resources for people? And Art Lily goes on to talk about how this person, they were raised in New Orleans. They call it the swamp. And they're talking about sort of the history of voodoo down in New Orleans area. And also, they talked a little bit about how they think that in the pagan community, voodoo is looked at in a bad way, in a negative way. They even use the term evil twin, though I've never heard that term used. So I want to address a little bit about that because I think that depending on where you are, you might hear more of a bad rap than you would in other places. So we'll touch on that. And then in addition to that question, we also have another question that's kind of goes along the same idea, which is all about hoodoo versus voodoo. And so the person is really asking about whether or not they should consider themselves a pagan, even though they prefer to do hoodoo. And they're trying to go on to say that they've done a lot of research into different types of practices, and they're really trying to figure out where they fit and what label fits them. And they want to know our thoughts and opinions on that. So I'm going to do my best to explain this. I'm also going to do my best to give a little bit of background information because I think that that's one of the most important things is to find some resources and some background stuff. The one thing that I didn't hear in any of these questions is the association with Santeria, with hoodoo and voodoo. Now, they're completely different religions. So in some ways, I'm glad that I didn't hear the association, but at the same time, it is something that commonly gets mixed up in the grouping. So I'm just sort of going to cover it a little bit in there because I feel like a lot of people might mistake voodoo for Santeria, and oftentimes hoodoo and voodoo get mixed up as well. So let's sort of talk about what are these things to begin with. We'll start in the back. We're talking about African-derived magical and religious systems here. So these practices, whether it's Santeria, Lukumi, or we're talking about voodoo or hoodoo, we're talking about African diasporic religions. So these are religious practices from different tribes that have evolved over time, that when they came over to America, they also began evolving in different ways and changing. So the first we'll start with is hoodoo. Hoodoo is folk magic. It is Southern folk magic. Hoodoo is the magical techniques of the Congo people of Africa, and it's not a religion. Oftentimes, you're going to see Protestant Christians and even practicing Catholics also practicing hoodoo. They sometimes go by the name root workers or conjurers. Oftentimes, they will produce things like mojo bags. They will also produce jack balls, other things like that. This is the magical practice that someone with a religion would be using, which would be hoodoo, which is a folk magic. So this isn't a religious practice. So when you talk about being a pagan who practices hoodoo, absolutely you can be that. They're not against each other. In fact, it sounds like a good addition to your practice, especially if it feels good for you. More power to you. Now let's sort of go into the bigger component of this, and that is voodoo and Santeria. So voodoo. Voodoo is an African diasporic religion. It is an amalgamation of different traditional African religious practices. There's a long history about it, and I put a link in the down bar below to give you more information if you're really interested in where all these things come from. So for voodoo, the primary liturgical language is Creole, and the local dialect is Haitian French. They also use veves, and I might be pronouncing that wrong. It's V-E-V-E-S. So it's one of those words that I'm not quite sure if I'm getting right, but these veves are not used in Santeria. So there is a difference too, especially because the questioner was from New Orleans. There is a very big difference between Louisiana voodoo and Haitian voodoo. And it's more of an amalgamation of the religious and magical practices in the southern United States. You need to look a little more into it if you want to know the intricacies of the differences. But basically what you're looking at is a magical and religious practice that incorporates an initiation rite. There is an initiation priesthood within voodoo. Now that doesn't mean that you have to be initiated to participate in the religion. However, really, most of the people who practice voodoo have been initiated. And there are oftentimes many ceremonies and things that you wouldn't be invited to or welcome at if you weren't an initiated participant. It's one of those traditions that it's kind of really important to get initiated because there's so much misinformation out there and you really will go down the wrong path pretty easily if you're not careful, if you're not being taught by somebody who has been taught by somebody who has been taught by somebody. You know, it's this oral tradition that's being passed on that's really valuable. And it's such a rich culture that in some ways I feel like, why wouldn't you want to get initiated if that's your calling? Santeria is also an initiate-based religion. However, the religion evolved in Cuba. It is descended and rooted in the African religious traditions, primarily of the Yoruba people. And the followers of Santeria, they actually worship the Orishas. And the Orishas are demigods of the Yoruba. And it's really important that we talk about the Orishas because that is the primary focus when you talk about Santeria. It is something that is shared with voodoo, but it's different. So it's important to note those differences. One of the great things that I love about Santeria, as well as voodoo, is the concept of ashe. And ashe is one of those things that's a little hard to translate into English, but basically ashe is similar to the idea of chi, of universal life energy and life force. It's this wonderful, powerful, amazing force, and I really enjoy it, and I like using it in my practice as an add-on. Now, on the outside, Santeria will look very Catholic. It has a veneer to it. However, once you get past that veneer, it's not Catholic at all. However, Santeria is very secretive. It's very initiatory, and it's also not something that can be overlapped with voodoo. Just because you're an initiate of voodoo does not mean that you're going to get into an initiate-only ceremony in Santeria, and vice versa. So it's important to know those differences. I'm including here a couple of images. The first image I'm going to include is of a hoodoo altar, and you'll notice that a hoodoo altar is, in this case, one who is a Protestant Christian, and they are a hoodoo practitioner. So that's a Southern folk magic along with their Christian religion. Also, a typical Haitian voodoo altar. They do have images of the Catholic saints and things like that. However, they are more of a veneer. It's not something that penetrates deep into the religion. One of the things that I really found interesting about this topic is that we often have this idea that things are looked down upon in the pagan community because they're not as understood or they're not as mainstream. And I think that it's important to remember that just because in your area something might be looked down upon doesn't mean that in all areas they are looked down upon. So in my local pagan community, we actually have many Voodoo practitioners, and they are actually highly regarded and pretty impressive. I am always in awe of them when I see them, and they are so wise, and they give the best advice and are some of the sweetest people I've ever met in my life. And so I think that it's really important that we recognize that just because there might be a stereotype in one area, maybe of the country or in a small friend group, that it doesn't apply to the larger pagan community. I certainly haven't noticed this discrimination or the evil twin syndrome or anything like that, and I feel really bad that you have. I hate to think that the pagan community is discriminating against anyone, mainly because we are really not about that. And we try and promote tolerance and openness and acceptance for our religion, and I would hope that we would be doing that for all other religions. I think it's important to note here too the term pagan. I feel like the term pagan has changed. Yes, back in the day, pagan meant anybody who had a religion other than an Abrahamic faith. However, I don't view that as the term pagan now. Pagan has come about and is created into a new word, basically meaning any earth-based spirituality, any earth-based religion. And when I think about Hindus or other polytheistic religions, that's the word that I would use for them. So for me, someone who practices Hindu, I would call them a polytheist. If I was trying to make a broader definition of their religion, if I wasn't just saying Hindu, I would say they're a polytheistic, which basically means they believe in more than one god. Now, pagans are also polytheistic, so that's something that we share in common. Now, there might be some that could even argue that some Christians are polytheistic and that they believe in more than one god as well because of the idea of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. But for most Christians, I would say they're monotheistic, believing in one god. And the idea is that paganism has become something other than. It has become its own thing. And so now, if you identify as pagan, you are identifying with a world that generally includes an earth-based religion, a balance of the masculine and the feminine, and a belief in multiple gods. Now, there's a lot more to it, obviously. However, that's the general broad definition because there's so many things that fit under that. It's important to understand, too, that in Santeria and in Voodoo, not necessarily in Hoodoo though, there is animal sacrifice. And this is something that many pagans don't do and that they view as something that can't be part of their practice. Many pagans follow the Wiccan Rede, any harm none, do as thou wilt. And so animal sacrifice would not be considered part of that. However, many pagans don't follow the Rede, and it's not something that they believe in. And that's okay too, and it still makes them pagan. And so when I think about a Voodoo practitioner or a Santeria practitioner, I think of them as being within the pagan community. And the reason why I say that is because the pagan community in general, as a whole, has come to represent these minority religions that are underrepresented and have an air of magic to them. Any religion that uses magic generally can fit under that umbrella of the pagan community. That doesn't mean they are pagan, though. And I think that that's an important distinction because many of my friends who are Voodoo practitioners and those that practice Santeria as well, they love going to pagan pride days and other pagan events. However, they don't identify as being pagan, but they feel like they belong to the pagan community. I think that's the big distinction here. Now, as far as Hoodoo is concerned, you can be pagan and practice Hoodoo, like we said, or you can be Christian and practice Hoodoo. The Hoodoo is not the religion part. So don't worry about that so much. And I think the other portion of it is find the label that works for you. The whole point about labels is to be able to identify yourself to those around you, whether it's like-minded or not like-minded, and to be able to find some sense of identity. That's what we're all searching for, is a sense of identity. Something that tells the world a little bit about us, or at least the important parts and the parts that we feel like we want to share. And that's what a label's for. Some people hate labels, and so they don't use them. More power to them. Some people love labels, and they want to label every single little bit of thing about them so that the whole world will know exactly who they are and where they stand and what they stand for. And more power to them. I think that the most important thing here, though, is to pick a label that you feel like fits you, and don't think that you can't use a label just because somebody else might think it's wrong. It's a label. You want to use it? Use it. There's no copyright on labels. So that's kind of all I had to say on the topic. I'm not a hoodoo practitioner, I'm not a voodoo practitioner, or a Santeria practitioner. So I can't really speak a lot to the intricacies of the religion, but I can say that it is a truly, truly spiritual, magical practice that really invokes some high magic and can be very powerful. And certainly the friends that I have who practice these religions are some of the most powerful witches I know. And they do call themselves witches, these particular practitioners. Some don't, though. So that again it's a chosen label. So you have to kind of just go with what feels right to you. So that's about it. I say go with your gut, pick something that feels right to you, and that most importantly tells the world what you want the world to know. That's all I think I can say on it, is be yourself and trust your gut. And I think you'll be fine. So that's it for today, guys, and hopefully you're having a wonderful week. I'm really hoping a star brings around the spring because it is cold and I am ready for the warm weather. I am dreaming of flip-flops and sundresses. So hopefully you guys are staying warm if you are in a warm place. I'm jealous. And I will see you guys next subs week. Blessed be.